Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 18 of the Not AFib podcast, powered by the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. My name is Mark Flauter. First responders frequently witness tragedy, suffering, and heartbreaking situations, experiences often referred to as just part of the job. Yet, in over 20 years in EMS, I've never heard the mention of first responder grief or anything that even hints at its existence. For lack of an established term, I will call it duty-bound grief. While grief takes many forms, this article will focus specifically on duty-bound grief, the type experienced by first responders. I will discuss what makes it unique and ways we can grow through it. Understanding duty-bound grief is much like understanding first responders themselves. It's complicated. Due to the unique nature of the job, we are especially susceptible to a combination of grief types. These include disenfranchised grief, which involves a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. Cumulative grief, arising from repeated exposure to trauma, and delayed grief, as we are often required to maintain a calm and composed demeanor while carrying out our duties. We also feel deeply the unexpected loss of colleagues, even those within the broader brotherhood we may not have known personally. As grief researcher Ken Doka explains, most occupations are not tasked with routine exposure to the violent, unexpected, and horrific life-changing situations that occur in emergency medicine, and yet we are given so few tools to help us manage this fire hose of grief. As first responders, we quickly learn how to turn off our emotions to focus on the job at hand. We manage by compartmentalizing. Picture it as packing a suitcase. Each time we encounter a natural emotion that could distract or deter us from our task, we set it aside in a mental suitcase. We might have a suitcase for grief, one for anger, another for fear. The list goes on. Over time, however, these suitcases can become so full that they start to overflow into other areas of our lives. This overflow can manifest as depression, intrusive thoughts, anger, substance abuse, apathy, and a diminished sense of joy. It can also appear as overworking, excessive gym visits, or any activity that helps us avoid confronting these overflowing emotions. When the suitcase is full, even the mildest emotional experience can feel overwhelming. That's why it's essential to start unpacking and processing this emotional baggage to maintain resilience over the long term. Additionally, we can learn techniques to recognize and process emotions after each incident, allowing us to avoid simply adding more to the suitcase. Grief isn't only experienced when someone we love dies. It can be a response to any significant loss. One notable factor that can intensify grief is when we identify with the patient or their family in some way. For example, when responding to cases involving children, the experience can change dramatically for those who are parents. As one first responder shared in a classroom of fellow responders and nurses, what changed for you when responding to and treating children after you became a parent? The answer was unanimous. Everything. Each of us brings different backgrounds, risk factors, resilience levels, and life experiences to every 911 call. What deeply affects one responder may have little impact on their partner. This is because it's never just the call. It's the call plus everything else. A tough call plus a difficult divorce, a career-impacting injury, a parent's declining health, financial hardships, or struggles with substance abuse. Often, it's the call that triggers the underlying risk factors we carry with us every day. And that is an excerpt from an article entitled Grief on the Front Line, Managing Our Hidden Wounds by Rachel Belcher. Rachel is a paramedic with the Baltimore County Fire Department. With over 25 years of experience in EMS as a former 911 operator and police dispatcher, she brings a wealth of firsthand knowledge to her advocacy for the mental health and well-being of first responders. Driven by overcoming her own mental health struggles after decades of exposure to trauma and grief in the line of duty, Rachel has dedicated her recent work to advocating, educating, and raising awareness surrounding the unique challenges faced by those on the front lines. Her mission is to inspire change and advocate for mental wellness, education, and resiliency tools to become a regular part of operational readiness nationwide. And it's my pleasure to welcome Rachel to the podcast. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mark. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So let's get started with go back a little bit to your beginning in EMS. What attracted you to EMS and what got you into the EMS field?
So I started in EMS shortly after high school. Um, I am the daughter of a state trooper, so public service is kind of in my veins. And I knew that I wanted to be a helper, even though what initially got me in the door was that's where my friends were hanging out at the time. So got the training. It was exciting. Always something new. I'm not a sit behind the desk kind of person. I like change. I like action. And I just really love helping people. So that's kind of what drew me to the career initially.
Okay. So did you get any grief from your father when you decided to go the fire EMS route as opposed to the law enforcement route?
No, I didn't get any grief from him. He did kind of prepare me. And at the time, in my youth, he said, this stuff will catch up with you. You have to be careful. You have to be aware. It'll catch up with you. And I heard it, I took it in, but I didn't truly understand the depth of what he was saying at the time. It took,
Mm.
many, many years for me to look back on that comment and say, okay, now I get it.
Right. Right. And I think for those of us like myself who don't have a family in law or in public safety, we I didn't get that advice, so it was hard to recognize until it actually started happening.
Yes.
What have you work in Baltimore County? Have you
Yes.
been in Maryland your entire life, or what
I
brought you to
have.
Baltimore County?
Yep. So I grew up in Baltimore
Okay,
County, and just never left.
okay,
I was born and raised here.
okay, okay. Um, so what changed your focus, or what brought your focus to the mental health portion of our field?
Sure. So, as you stated in my intro, so I started as a volunteer EMT. Then I went into dispatch. I was a 911 operator and a police dispatcher. And as an EMT, I had a little exposure here and there to some some pretty bad calls. But at the time, being young and not having a whole lot of life experience. Um, a lot of those calls from my late teens, very early 20s didn't really stick with me. Then when I became a dispatcher, um and being able to hear the distress in the people's voices and then not know what the outcome was really gave me that compassion that I still have today for dispatchers and 911 operators who are kind of left with a lot of unanswered
Mhm.
questions. And so I most certainly consider those folks first responders as well. Um, and they need this mental health education just as much as we do. So when I went into EMS, um, pretty much from the jump, I had some pretty horrific calls involving children. I had a loaded gun pointed to my face. I mean, just the kind of stories that we all have. And they started to build up and build up. And probably at year 15, I started to feel, this is kind of catching up on me. The sleep deprivation, the calls, I would notice that I felt anxious. I would start to notice that when I had a particularly distressing call. So for me, suicides are my trigger call. Um, and what's interesting and what I know now is that when you have a very distressing call. So for me, a suicide. I wasn't just experiencing the emotions from that call. I was experiencing the emotions from every previous similar call that I had
Mhm.
had. So that accumulation of experiences is all kind of tied together by a cord in our minds and our emotions. So um, what I understand is that sometimes we'll be in 20 years and we'll have a call that seems kind of benign and that'll be the one that puts us over the edge. And what I hear is like, I don't understand that this call wasn't even that bad. I don't know why this is the one that did it. Well, it's because that call is attached to a cord that has an entire string of other
Mhm.
similar experiences to it. So it's not necessarily just that one call. That was just the one that overflowed. the suitcase. So 2023, I had a series of traumatic events, which kind of left me feeling completely broken. I described it as brain damage. I felt really uncomfortable saying anything. In the fire service, we hold put very high value in tradition, and because of tradition, we are also quite resistant to change, and we kind of hold dear those values that were instilled in us coming up. And a lot of those values were, if you are suffering or having a hard time with this job, maybe it's because you're not cut out for it. Um, you knew what you signed up for.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know why you're surprised that you're seeing these things. And I wasn't surprised that I was seeing these things. I was just nervous to seek help because of those kind of like ingrained, I'm going to call them generational cycles that need to be broken. You know, some traditions absolutely should be carried forward. The tradition of shunning people and making them feel less than for having emotional responses, natural human emotional responses to calls, is a tradition that should be broken for sure. So early 2023, I made the decision after I realized that I had changed to a point where I didn't even recognize myself. I couldn't think straight. I was still performing at a high level at work because that muscle memory kicks in, and kind of we are able to do our job despite everything else. But I was an empty shell. I call it I was a gray crayon. I had lost all my
Mhm.
color. I just
Mhm.
um, I did not like myself. So I took the step to go away for 30 days to Harbor of Grace, which is a first responder centric recovery center in Havre de Grace, Maryland, and left my husband and my kids. Hardest decision I have made, but incredibly needed. And I'm very grateful that that was available to me.
That's great. And you hit nail right on the head just a few moments ago. I just finished my 25th year here at the fire district where I work. I first started in 2000 when the district first started running their own ambulance. I was one of the paramedics hired for that ambulance, and that was very much, you hit very much on the mindset of so many of the senior personnel when we started in 2000 was, you don't talk about this stuff. To quote some different people that have said it, you rub dirt on it and you get back in the game. And unfortunately, that just doesn't hold water here in 2025. And that's one of the reasons that I have you on today. One of my focuses with this particular podcast is to talk about mental health, talk about breaking the stigma, and not being afraid to say, I need help. I'm not all right. So I appreciate you sharing your story with us. I've experienced some very similar thoughts and feelings to what you just described. And when you're not afraid to step out and say you need help, there's something wrong, it's amazing what can happen afterwards.
I can't agree more. And, you know, I do see a shift, a shift in the mindset. You know, it's nowhere where it needs to be or where it
Mhm.
should be. There's still a lot of that kind of old school thought hanging around.
Mhm.
You know, it's kind of like when you're brought up by a parent who, from the depression, they're gonna, you know, they're gonna have a specific way of behaving, similar to, you know, when you're brought up in the fire service being taught a certain thing. It's kind of difficult to say, you know what, this stops with me. We're not going to do this anymore.
Right.
And the thought that asking for help or stepping up or experiencing very, very normal human emotion is somehow a sign of weakness, when
Mhm.
actually being able to feel and express how you're feeling, you know, I can't think of a more brave way to behave and act. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I kind of like to point out is, so what's predictable is preventable. It's very predictable that public safety, fire, EMS, police, etc., we have a much higher suicide rate. We have a much higher rate of depression, anxiety. We have a much higher rate of substance use disorder. We have a much higher rate of divorce, and like all of those things that kind of that chain reaction that starts when we begin to repress all of the emotions that are associated with the things we experience at work. And it really affects our life. And as you mentioned in the article, in the excerpt about the compartmentalization, we have to do that to do our job. Compartmentalizing in itself isn't a bad thing. It can be done in a healthy way. We do it in the moment because we need to get through and complete our duty. But what we've never been taught is how to then go back and process the things that we've shoved away for the moment so that we can, and then what that causes is accumulation. So going back to what's predictable is preventable, we can't prevent the exposure to traumatic events. That part is part of the job. I'll agree with that. What's not part of the job is leaving people without the tools to prevent the accumulation and the buildup of that, of those experiences. We need to offer the education to say, this is normal, but you don't have to stay this way. Or this is normal. Let me teach you how to not get to the point where you're in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that hopefully we're moving in that direction more slowly than
Right.
I would like to see. But
Mm-hmm.
so I come out of Harbor Grace. It was terrific. However, I was not fixed after 30 days. I don't think 30 days is, I'm not suggesting it should be longer. It gives you all the tools. It kind of sets you up, and then you kind of have to take the responsibility to continue that healing. So
Mm-hmm.
it probably took another year and a half. I regularly saw an incredible EMDR therapist. I didn't even know what EMDR was prior to going in. It's I'm sorry. I'm movement desensitization, EMD, reprogramming. And it's one of the most studied, like evidence-based trauma recovery therapy methods.
Mm-hmm.
Really effective for kind of taking those memories that we have stored in what should be our temporary file and storing them properly in our long-term memory. And what
Mm-hmm.
that allows is so that when you hear something, see something, smell something, drive past something, and you get that emotional, that like physical response, my heart starts pounding, I'm sweating, I'm feeling anxious, I don't know why. That's your body physically reacting to a memory that you may or may not be aware of. And when those things are processed properly, you'll have the memory. It's not erasing your memory, but it's allowing you to remember it as something that happened, not something that your body is physically responding to,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome.
Yes. A couple episodes ago, I had a colleague from my area who was involved in our IAFF locals peer support team. He was involved in a very traumatic event while on the job, resulted in the career-ending injury of one of his partner at the time, and then he sustained a pretty significant injury as a result. Led him down a very dark path toward addiction, substance abuse. He finally was able to get help and is now in the peer support team. So one of the things that we discussed was if the ability or the availability of peer support. Um, can you comment on your feelings on peer support? He says if peer support had been available at the time of his incident, it may have helped prevent him from going down that path. Is this something that's prevalent in your area? And if so, what are your feelings on peer support as maybe an initial step?
Yeah. So I think peer support is an incredible resource. Um, and I think that people truly like underestimate and take for granted the power of just talking about it.
Mhm.
You know, therapy worked for me. but everybody doesn't need or want therapy. Just having someone that you trust to talk about what happened, how you're feeling, even sitting around the table, at the firehouse. That
Mhm.
is therapeutic. That is technically, it's not official peer support, but that is peer
Right.
support. And having, a network of peer support folks who are trained in kind of like recognizing the signs if someone is feeling like they want to hurt themselves or someone else, and then having all of the resources lined up to be able to help them get that information and resources. It is an incredibly valuable
Mhm.
resource that I think is underutilized because um, I'm not exactly sure why. And I think for our department, and we're really working very hard on building out. I don't want to say improving. I mean, it was good before, but relationships need to be established before a crisis.
Right.
And you need to have someone that you trust and someone that you can talk to before there's an emergency, or before, because you're not going to want to open up to someone that you don't know or trust.
Mhm.
So I think an important part of peer support is kind of getting out there to the members, talking to people, establishing relationships before it gets to the point where there's a crisis, so that when there is, and peer support is like, hey guys, we're here. We're not here to force you to do anything or to talk, but that trusted relationship is established.
Yes. And that's one of the things that he mentioned was establishing that trust, building that trust, because one of the things that he found was that people are reluctant to use peer support for the fact that they don't know where that information is going to go. They're afraid that tell a firefighter, that it's going to get leaked out, and then you run right back into that mindset that we talked about, that, hey, maybe this isn't for you, rub some dirt on it, get back in the game.
Yes, yeah. And, that is a roadblock for
Mhm.
sure. And I think really the only way to overcome that is to build those relationships and just kind of make the proof be in the pudding of, you know, you can trust me and I'm going to prove that you can. And I'm going to prove that you can trust me before you're having a problem.
Mhm.
One of the things that I've identified, additionally as an issue, it seems like a lot of organizations are kind of tackling mental health with the checkbox mentality. Like, we have EAP, check. We have a peer support team, check. It's like just checking off boxes isn't enough. And
Right.
the reason that I say that is because firemen are a lot like, let's say, farmers. A farmer isn't going to the emergency room unless they've tried the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth line of defense. Like, they got stuff to do. They're
Right.
not going to the emergency room unless they're having an emergency. And it's the same thing for first responders. We're not asking for help until it's an emergency. And then, the answer, if there's not a robust peer network, we'll call EAP. Okay, you're calling EAP. They're setting you up with a therapist. Okay, are they culturally competent? Do they know anything about first responders? Are they providing the evidence-based best trauma recovery? Or do they do EMDR? Do
Mhm.
they do CBT? Am I going to go sit down with them and tell them about my last call, and they're going to be the one in tears, and I'm going to be therapizing them because I've now
Mhm.
traumatized my therapist? So simply having an EAP network is just a text checkbox, because it needs to be tailored to the population that you're serving. And we need to have vetted, culturally competent clinicians, so that we don't send someone in crisis to, let's say, a talk therapist who knows nothing about first responders. They now waste 6 months going to talk therapy, walk out of there saying, well, that didn't help. I did what I was supposed to do. I went to therapy. I asked for help. I still feel terrible. Okay, my thought is now solidified. I'm broken. There's nothing I can do to change myself. And it's really criminal, in my opinion,
Yes.
to know for a fact that we're more susceptible to these psychological injuries and not set us up. It's almost negligent to
Yes.
not. And I'm going to take away the almost. It is negligent to know for a fact the probability that we're going to suffer from these type of issues
Mhm.
and have just the absolute minimum resources available.
Right. Yeah.
But that's
Last summer for Mental Health Awareness Month, I had we had a counselor, a therapist on, and you almost verbatim quoted some of the things that she said regarding the culturally educated therapists. She relayed instances that you just mentioned where the provider that had gone for therapy ended up being therapizing the therapist because what they had explained put the therapist into tears.
yes,
So you it's tremendously important to be more than a checkbox, to have people that understand the unique nature of our business, of our problems, and that are competently trained to help us deal with them, so that when we go to seek help, when we actually talk to somebody, that we can be confident, we can be sure that they're going to understand and provide us what we need.
absolutely. And I think that's why I have such a big push toward, mental wellness needs to be a part of operational readiness. And
Mhm.
it seems so obvious. How is it not just as important as throwing ladders? How is it not just as important as um, CPR training?
Right.
Um, we know without a doubt that we are going to have these psychological, barriers come
Mhm.
up. Yet, for some reason, it's not a priority. And then they wonder, oh gosh, why are people quitting?
Mhm.
Why 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 are we have why are we having a hard time with like getting applicants?
Right.
Because not only do we have the psychological aspect of the job, we have sleep deprivation. We have, not many breaks.
Mhm.
In my department, when an EMS person comes in, they go out on their first run and they don't come back till the end of their shift, 10 to 14 hours later.
Mhm.
Um, I think the fire side has a bit higher job satisfaction simply because they have a little bit more downtime. They do run often with the medic units, don't get me
Mhm.
wrong.
Right.
Um, both incredibly important functions of a fire service, but EMS people are just, I mean, burnt
Yes.
out.
Yes. Yes. And that leads us into something that I wanted to talk with you. In the article, you talk about resiliency. And you mentioned resiliency is our ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, a critical skill in a career that's filled with constant challenges. Talk to us a little bit about resiliency, how we can build resiliency, and the importance that that plays down the road in maybe keeping someone from having to seek a therapist or going into crisis.
Absolutely. So let me start just with briefly kind of an overview, and I'm sure most of the listeners know the whole like fight or flight, rest and
Mhm.
relax thing. That's kind of been something that's talked about quite a bit. Um, our bodies are meant for sprints, not marathons. So this fight or flight response is meant to be temporary. We kick in, our brain says, we're saving your life right now, or we're escaping the bear, or whatever it is. And then it's supposed to turn off and all of the normal functions kick back in. Well, during fight or flight, which for a lot of us becomes chronic stress response, which is just prolonged fight or flight, some of us just remain in that state. You have the epinephrine, you have the hormones, you have the cortisol, all of these hormones that are meant to be saving your life, coursing through our bodies a lot more than they should be. Um, when that happens, our brains aren't working fully because our bodies are focusing on running and getting out of there. Our gut, our guts aren't working properly, our hormones are out of whack, our sleep cycles are out of whack. So a lot of us find that even when we're off duty, we can't sleep, we can't relax, we can't, it's very difficult to get out of that fight or flight state. And I know um, for me, I would take 2 tricks off, which is like 21 days. And it wasn't until like day 18 where I was like, oh, that's weird. I forgot what my muscles felt like to be relaxed. So there's a lot of studies. They say that like the best thing that you can do is meditate. Now, meditation is amazing, but we just it's very difficult. Sometimes it takes months or years to master meditating to the point where you're actually getting the effect of our bodies getting to the point where they can heal themselves. So what's important about resiliency and how like meditation and yoga and journaling and kind of things outside of the fire service, we're having to teach our body how to get back into that rest and relax phase, out of fight or flight, completing that stress response. And we have to train our bodies to do that, just like we train our bodies to do anything else. Like consider it like going to the gym. The first time you go to the gym, you're not lifting a 200-pound deadlift. You have to start slow. So my recommendation is, and in the article, there is a like a resiliency worksheet, breathing exercises, kind of like different exercises. So my recommendation just at the very beginning is to pick one of those exercises. And I think there might be 18 or more, I'm not sure. And just do one of those after every single call. And some of them take 10 seconds. And the point of it is to complete the stress response, to tell your body, okay, that call is over. Let's come down and complete this stress response to get ready for the next one. Sounds very simple, but eventually, and I say to do it on every one, because if you're training your body to do that on every single call, taking 30 seconds to do a breathing exercise after every call and just come back down, ground yourself. You don't have to wonder, well, was that call stressful enough for me to be able to do it? Or that one really didn't seem to bother me. We have, I think that we oftentimes gaslight ourselves in that, like, whatever, even kind of bad calls, that, I'm fine, whatever, let's go to the next one. So instead of having to decide if a call is stressful enough where you need to do a grounding exercise, just do it after every one. Consider
Okay.
it like a little tiny vacation or a break. And then we're kind of training our bodies to get back into that relaxation realm. It's really important when you're off duty. Obviously, sleep and rest is important. When you look at all the studies and all the professionals who are talking about resiliency, not first responders, sleep is a bit, make sure you're getting 8 hours of sleep. That just simply doesn't happen
Right.
for us. It just
Right.
doesn't happen.
Right.
So get as much sleep as you can, obviously. But I think it's important to make sure that you're setting time aside for some kind of self-care. Don't just scroll it, put the phone down, do yoga, um, journal, make a piece of art, go walk in nature if it's nice outside. Even if you're just sitting in silence, go to a shelter and pet some dogs. I mean, there's so many different things to just allow your body and your mind to connect again, because what happens is our brains and our bodies become disconnected. We're not feeling, if we're in pain or we have tension, we've trained ourselves to ignore those things, to be able to kind of push through that is us. I'm
Yeah.
here to do a job. I'm going to push through. I don't care if I have pain. I don't care if I'm tired. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
So
And you talk a little bit more later in the article, under the section called "Pay Now or Pay Later." You talk about regular mental hygiene practices. Talk to us a little bit about what that entails for someone who may not be familiar with what good mental hygiene is. Talk to us a little bit about how you can practice that in dealing with some of the stressors and issues that you just described.
Absolutely. So it could be as simple as talking to a friend on the telephone. One of the things that I've noticed is the first kind of like indicator that there's a problem is isolation. Um, Sleeping a lot, staying in bed, not talking to people, not reaching out. Um, so just check in with someone. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even have to be a deep, conversation about calls. Just check in with someone. Have something, anything that you enjoy, no matter how small the practice is, that you can say, I'm going to implement this today. This is for my, mental hygiene or whatever. Even if it's every day I'm going to write one thing I'm grateful for. Every day I'm going to take 5 minutes. There's an app called Insight Timer. I'm going to do a 5-minute meditation, guided meditation. I'm going to walk. And it has to start small like that. Because if you say, I'm going to do an hour meditation, first respond, after 5 minutes, we're like, okay, I'm bored. Let's do something else.
Yeah.
So it's just making a commitment to yourself to do anything that will help your mind and your body connect.
Mm-hmm.
And then that, listen to your body, and that can evolve into something different. When you start listening to your body, when you start having that mind body connection, you will know what you need. Everybody's a little bit different. Your body and your mind will tell you, oh, I'm feeling creative, I want to do this, or I'm feeling like I need some social interaction, or I'm feeling like I need to go get a smoothie. Like it's just, it can be very simple. It doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
to be anything complicated. It's just the act of, let's start prioritizing ourselves and doing something even small to take care of ourselves.
You talk a little bit further in the article about self-assessment and why it's important to assess yourself regularly. Describe to us, talk to us a little bit about how, maybe if you want to describe your routine, or if you just want to describe generally how we can do a self-assessment and the importance of doing a self-assessment to stave off maybe a crisis down the road.
Yes. So, and this kind of goes back a little bit to that mind body connection, how it becomes separated. It almost becomes a numbness feeling where somebody, are you in pain? Like, I honestly don't know. So take some time to yourself, lay down. So there's a couple different types of self-assessment. So you can do, like, online, they have like a resiliency self-assessment. And um, you might do a self-assessment for resiliency today and get a certain number, and then you might do one next week and it'll be completely different. And that is totally normal because life, ebbs and flows.
Mm-hmm.
But what it will give you an idea of is like what your baseline is. And sometimes we don't even know that we're struggling. We don't even know that there's an issue without kind of saying, okay, let me look at these factors. So um, there's some resiliency self-assessments, and then there's something called a body scan, which it's quite simple. You're gonna lay down somewhere quiet, make sure you have like 10 minutes, and start at your toes, kind of take a couple of deep breaths, and you're just gonna feel your toes. Okay, wiggle your toes around, feel the tops of your feet, the bottoms of your feet. You're just connecting your mind to your body, and you're feeling all the parts of your body. And I don't mean physically feeling, I mean just acknowledging that they exist, noticing if there's any pain, noticing if there's any tension. And you're going to do that very slowly up your entire body. If you come to an area of tension, take a deep breath, try to relax that tension. And what this is doing is bringing awareness to you to say, oh, I'm holding tension in my hips. Interesting. I never realized that before.
Mm-hmm.
or I'm holding tension in my upper back. And if you practice that regularly, let's say you commit to doing it once a week or something like that, eventually you'll realize when you start to get anxious, you'll say, "Oh my gosh, my shoulders are up here." And oh, okay. And you just kind of begin to consciously just be aware of your body, where you're holding the tension, where you're holding the stress in your body, and it's easier to acknowledge it and address it in the moment rather than it building up and you saying like, I just don't feel good and I don't know why, I don't know where it's coming from.
Hmm.
And that can really help with like long term, just being able to recognize things in your body when they come up, because emotions come out as physical pain
Right.
oftentimes. Once you repress your emotions enough, it's not that it absolutely will come out as physical symptoms. It can be autoimmune disease, it can be chronic pain, it can be cancer even.
Hmm.
I mean, there's a doctor that I love listening to called Gabor Mate, who discusses like in length about many medical disease processes that he believes are stemmed directly from like childhood, um, like emotional repression from
Hmm.
adverse childhood experiences.
It's interesting you bring that up. A couple times on the podcast in different episodes, I've mentioned there's a book, and I'm confident you're familiar with it, called "The Body Keeps the Score."
Absolutely.
Yes, yes, I've read it as well. And it's amazing how when you read through the book and they talk about some of the childhood traumas, how they manifest themselves in adult life. It's amazing how you can, personally, how I identified some of my behaviors directly linked back to some of the things that happened to me in my childhood.
So Dr. Mate says if you send 100 soldiers to war, 20 of them will come back with PTSD. And he said the commonality between those 20 soldiers is that they all had adverse childhood experiences.
Mm.
So um, having trauma in our past leaves us more susceptible to PTSD. However, I know it's called post-traumatic stress disorder, but it really is an injury, something that can be healed,
Mhm. Right.
something that we can overcome. And and one thing that I want to stress for anyone that might be entering into this realm of healing, and if it feels scary, it is hard. It is not quick, but it is 1,000,000% worth it. You will be confronted with some things that you might not want to think about, or things that you've been pushing aside because they feel too hard. But truly, um, and if you have some big traumatic events, you're going to want to probably do this with a
Mhm.
professional, obviously. Um, but speaking from personal experience and feeling like I feel this way because it's the natural progression of the job. This is just how I'm going to feel. I'm just broken. This is just the way that I am. And now knowing that that's just not simply not the case. Do the hard work, and it is truly life-changing and opens up your mind to limitless
Mhm.
possibilities. And then talking about your experiences with other people opens up something in them so that they feel more comfortable talking about it and they don't feel alone, which is why, this article was so important to me. I went to Harbor Grace for 30 days. I was doing all this EMDR and thinking like, gosh, why am I still not feeling better? I feel like I still have a lead blanket on me. I'm doing all the right things. And I realized that the grief that we experience at work is not something that's talked about or addressed. When we have to make a death notification to an 80-year-old gentleman that his wife of 65 years has passed, and you're holding this man in your arms whose entire life, the witness of his entire life is gone. That, that's almost worse than picking up a brain off the road
Hmm.
sometimes.
Right.
And we experience those type of situations way more than the very highly traumatic, gory, kind of call.
Hmm.
And that type of grief isn't something that we acknowledge.
Right.
So it's hard for us even to process w- what what we're holding on to when it's never been talked about.
Hmm.
And
Right.
that's kind of why what brought me to writing this article and identifying, it doesn't have to be blood and guts and gore and horrific, violence. It can
Right.
be something quite benign, but when they just accumulate many, many, many over years, they say, like, I think an average person has four traumatic experiences in their life, and for us
Right.
it's like 400 in a career.
Right. Right. Exactly. And yeah, those are definitely numbers in the ballpark that I've read. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the reasons that I asked you to come on the podcast that I explained in our initial correspondences was, and you talked about just a few moments ago, that big traumatic event. Um, and being in Baltimore County, you're not too far from Washington, D.C. And obviously you're well aware and familiar. And you may actually know people that have been working after the collision between the helicopter and the plane crash. Then we had the medical plane crash in Philadelphia, followed by the plane crash in Alaska. Now we've recently had an incident in Toronto. Obviously, in Toronto, there were no deaths involved, fortunately, but still, 21, I think, people were taken to the hospital. Two of them are still hospitalized with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. Those are those big traumatic events that do take a toll on the responders, especially when you're dealing with like the helicopter plane crash, when you have bodies that are being pulled from the river over multiple days. You also talked about the cumulative effects for those of us that don't have those quote unquote once in a career calls. That's going to be our main problem, is dealing with those. You talked about comforting the gentleman whose wife of 60 plus years has just passed away. The just those repeated calls until you get to that one point where it breaks you, as opposed to that one traumatic event, that Oklahoma City bombing, that Columbine, that DC plane crash. Those obviously take a toll initially, but more often than not, it's the cumulative effect of 20-25 years in the business of running these calls day after day that finally gets to a lot of us.
Yeah. And I think just giving ourselves grace and understanding that we are allowed to grieve for people that we didn't personally know.
Mhm.
Um, I think that we just, repress that part of the job because what we talked about earlier, that tradition, that kind of ingrained thought that you didn't know them, what do you care, you're here to
Mhm.
do a job. We're allowed to grieve and honor those people in whatever way we see fit. And I feel like sometimes, especially with these massive, just devastating incidents, and the responders that are out there, doing that very, very hard work, having some kind of um, avenue to honor the victims, um, kind of honor them and let them go. Like, you don't have to carry them with
Mhm.
you for the rest of your life. You don't have to carry them with you. You can honor them, you can grieve for them, and you can allow them to go.
Mhm.
I think that's the main takeaway because, gosh, there's really, it's so difficult. There's really, nothing you can say to take away the things that those responders have seen and had to do. But I think just the process of acknowledging and honoring it is really powerful.
Mhm. For talk to us a little bit, if you will, about for someone that may be listening that is saying, I'm having a hard time letting go. I keep carrying these images with me. how can someone go about moving on? It may not necessarily moving on, but letting go, as you just mentioned.
Sure. So I guess it is very individual. If you have something that is sticking with you, let's say for years, I would recommend seeking professional help with like an
Mm,
EMDR therapist or someone with CBT, making sure that you're finding someone that's culturally competent. Um, Most peer support networks will have a list of vetted clinicians and resources. If you are in the fire department and your department doesn't have that, there's a lot of police departments that you
mm,
could reach out to that have lists like that. There's just a lot of resources. You don't have to just call EAP and be flapping in the wind, because that truly isn't the best path. It's available and it's there, and I'm not telling anyone not to do that. Um, it just it isn't the most direct route.
right.
Um, so that would be my first suggestion, is to try to seek professional help. If you go to therapy, you don't have to go to therapy forever. You know,
Mm,
it's kind of like when you're ill with any other thing. You seek the treatment, and then you have the tools, and then you can go. And if you need to go once every couple months, or if you don't need to go ever again.
mm,
In addition, peer support is really important, like peer support nights or drop-ins where you can sit together with a group of people who've been through similar experiences. If you don't like the in-person thing, there's a lot of online peer support groups.
mhm.
If you're struggling and you feel like you're in crisis, there's the IAFF Center of Excellence, and
Yes.
in Maryland, Harbor of
Yes.
Grace. Uh, Both of those are really good resources that are very culturally competent. And I think that those resources specifically are targeted for things that are sticky. I say we come into this fire department, everybody comes in, and you touched on this a little. We all have a bucket when we
Mhm.
come into the academy. Some of our buckets are little teeny tiny, some of our buckets are huge, some of our buckets are already full, and some of them are empty. These resiliency things and what we're talking about, and hopefully the tools and resources and education that we can give future generations, will help us to dump out the bucket and not wait until they're overflowing.
Right.
But every now and then, no matter how good you are with your self-care and your resiliency, you're going to get a sticky call every now and then that doesn't
Right.
want to come out.
Right.
That's just a fact of the matter.
Mhm.
And it is best to have a professional help you through those,
Right.
because oftentimes that call is sticky because it's hooked to something that happened previously in your life, maybe
Mhm.
in your childhood, maybe in your early adulthood, and you're not realizing the connection. But to process that call, other things might come up for you
Right.
that you'll need help with processing. um, we are not broken.
Mhm.
We are very normal, emotional human beings who have been taught to repress, who have been taught that it is heroic to keep everything inside.
Mhm.
um, but it is actually heroic to just be a human and say, hey, look, I've been doing this however long. I'm having a hard time. I would like to continue and finish my career with dignity. So I'm going to get the help that I need.
Mhm.
And I don't want to see a single other public service worker die by suicide
Right.
because they felt like they didn't know where to go, or they didn't know what to do, or they felt embarrassed. Like, we're all we're all here in the same boat, and we you don't have to suffer in silence.
Yep. Yep. And that's part of the reason that I am so, I guess for lack of a better term, dedicated to bringing awareness. Is I know two people right off the top of my head. One was a classmate when I went through the fire academy. One was a coworker at the hospital-based EMS system I worked before I started here at the fire district, both of whom died by suicide. So that's why it's important to me to promote mental health, good mental hygiene, as you mentioned, resiliency, caring for ourselves, and providing avenues to care when it's needed. You mentioned earlier vetting those providers. Here in Missouri, we have a website. I believe it's called the Missouri First Provider or Missouri First Response Provider Network, something along those lines, where you can go, and these are all providers that have been vetted as culturally competent, as you mentioned. So I'm sure those people who are listening who may be looking for a vetted, culturally competent therapist, if you're in the IAFF, start with your local and see if they can give you a list of vetted providers and go from there. Just lost my train of thought. So as we get ready to wrap up, Rachel, just some closing thoughts from you. You've talked obviously about your experiences at Harbor Grace, as well as some of the different coping mechanisms, if you will, self-assessment, resiliency that you've mentioned. Any closing thoughts for people listening out there who may be struggling and listening to this and saying, okay, I need to take care of myself? What are some thoughts that you can leave with them?
I would say that there's no embarrassment in having normal human feelings. There's nothing to be ashamed of. If someone tries to make you feel ashamed or less than, it's likely that maybe they have
Mhm,
their own repressed emotions that they're feeling uneasy about.
mhm,
I am very open with my story. A lot of peer support networks, and I completely understand it. You'll have the meeting and they'll say, "What happens here stays here," because they want the confidence. I myself will shout my story from the rooftops
mhm.
because I need people to know that this is just the truth. I'm not hiding it, because if someone else, and I know there is someone else who was feeling like I want them to know that they're not alone,
Right.
um, and that there is hope, and you can heal and feel better, and you can complete your career with dignity.
Mhm,
You're not broken. Um, there's also nothing wrong with coming to a point in your career to say, "Hey, I don't want to see dead kids anymore.
mhm.
I'm done."
Right.
Um, you know, that is an individual choice, and that is also a very brave choice to
Mhm,
make. Um, we all have our own path. We have servant and helper hearts. I think all of us who've come into this job,
agreed.
um, we want to help, and sometimes we help to the point where we forget to help ourselves. We
Right.
get so caught up in taking care of other people that we don't take care of ourselves. So I think it's important to just be there for each other. If someone on your shift or at your station seems different or off, I think that it should be acceptable to, with discretion and dignity and confidence, say, "Are you okay? Like, is there anything that you want to talk
Mhm.
about? I've noticed you seem down. Is there anything I can help you with?" Or uh, just kind of look out for each other.
Right. Right. And a couple of things you just said reminded me what I was going to say before. You mentioned finishing with a long or with a dignified career. For a lot of us in the fire service, EMS, we have aspirations beyond our career. Um, I I am looking at retirement in the next 5.5 years. My wife has already got plans for travel after I retire. So I'm sure you're probably very similar. There's a life after our service that we want to live, and by taking care of ourselves now, we're going to enable us to live those lives that we want to live after our public service is over. So just another reason that it's important to take some of what you've said to heart and take care of ourselves so that we're there for our families who've supported us through our careers. Some of them have been they've been our anchors as we've gone through some very turbulent waters. So it's important for us to be there for them after our service is over.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
Rachel, thank you so much. As we get ready to wrap up, I do have one final question, not related to mental health or anything else that we've discussed. Maybe just a little bit. What's the last book that you read?
Oh, it was a Gabor Mate book, The Myth of Normal.
Okay.
It's really good. I
Okay.
recommend it. I kind of fibbed because I didn't read it. I listened to it on an audiobook
That's
because
okay.
on my commute.
I, I do that too. I have about a 30 to 40-minute drive, depending on traffic, to work. So audiobooks, I usually go through. My goal this year is to go through one a month at least. But I do go through several a year on my commute, as you mentioned. So audiobooks work just fine for me as well.
Well, now you
Um,
have to tell me I'm going to ask you the same question so I know what to read next.
I just finished, and I borrowed this from my chief. I finished The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, which
Okay.
is Admiral William McRaven. He is famous for the Make Your Bed speech, the 4-star Navy
I
SEAL
love him.
admiral. Yes, yes. And that is very good. It's extremely quick and easy read, and a lot of great nuggets on leadership in this book. So that is the last one that I read, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog. Highly recommend it.
I'm going to pick that up. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Yes. As we get ready to wrap up, any social media that you want to leave us with?
I have a LinkedIn, Rachel Belcher.
Okay.
Um, yeah, that's really about it. I'm new to this sphere here.
Okay.
I'm really enjoying meeting so many different new people, and I'm just very excited to see where all this goes. And I'm excited to just make a better path for future generations.
Outstanding. Well, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with us. I appreciate your openness, all the words of wisdom that you imparted upon us. Once again, the name of the article: "Grief on the Front Line: Managing Our Hidden Wounds." It's available Gems online, and there's so much in the article that we just briefly touch the surface, scratch the surface here. So I highly recommend you look it up. For us here at the podcast, thank you for taking time to listen. We are on Instagram at not_a_fib_podcast. You can email us at not.a.fib.podcast@gmail.com. I want to take time once again to thank you all for joining us. Take care out there, and we'll talk to you again next month.